Stop. If you force that starter one more time, you'll damage something that can't be replaced. The voice came from the back of the crowd, calm enough that people almost ignored it. Almost. Every camera turned toward the man in a faded canvas work jacket, standing beside a row of food trucks instead of the VIP platform. He wasn't holding a toolbox. He wasn't wearing the logo of a famous restoration shop. To most people, he looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong event. On the giant screen behind the stage, the challenge flashed again. $500,000. Start Harrison Vale's 1969 Camaro. 3 nationally known restoration specialists had already failed that afternoon. One blamed the ignition. Another insisted the fuel system had been sabotaged. The last had walked away shaking his head after nearly an hour under the hood. The glossy black Camaro sat beneath bright Texas sunlight, untouched except for fingerprints on the polished fenders and the growing frustration surrounding it. Declan Shaw didn't move. He simply kept watching. Not the engine. The people. Their hands. Their assumptions. Beside him stood his 12-year-old son, Mason, balancing 2 paper cups of lemonade. "You keep staring at that car like it's talking to you," Mason said. Declan smiled faintly. "It is." Mason laughed. "Dad, it's a car." "So? It doesn't have a mouth." "No." Declan kept his eyes on the Camaro. "But people usually tell you more about a machine than the machine tells you about itself. Before we go any further, I'd love to know something about you. How old are you? Where are you watching from? And have you ever found yourself in a situation where everyone else seemed certain they had the answer?" A few yards away, television reporters surrounded Harrison Vale, the billionaire collector whose challenge had become the biggest attraction of the annual Lone Star Classic Auto Expo. $500,000 wasn't just prize money. It was entertainment. People weren't only waiting to see the Camaro start. They were waiting to see someone become a hero. Or a fool. Near the inspection station, automotive systems engineer Audrey Sinclair reviewed another set of diagnostic notes. Every reading matched what the previous experts had recorded, yet none of their explanations agreed with each other. She looked up and noticed Declan watching from the edge of the crowd. Unlike everyone else, he hadn't reached for a wrench. He hadn't taken a single photograph. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was observing. That alone made him interesting. Mason nudged his father's shoulder. "You could fix it, couldn't you?" Declan didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of lemonade. "I don't know." Mason raised an eyebrow. "That's not what you usually say." Declan looked down at the grease embedded around his fingernails. "There was a time I would have answered that question before anyone finished asking it." "What changed?" His expression tightened for just a moment. "I did." The loudspeaker crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're opening the challenge to anyone willing to step forward. No reservations. No invitations. If you believe you can start this Camaro, now is your chance." The crowd buzzed with excitement. Mason looked up at his father with hopeful eyes. Declan stared at the stage. His garage was 3 months behind on rent. Bills were stacked on the kitchen counter. $500,000 could erase every one of those problems. But another thought refused to leave him. The last time he'd stepped into a crowd believing he already knew the answer. Someone else had paid the price. His feet stayed exactly where they were. For now. The loudspeaker repeated the invitation twice more. No reservations. No qualifications. If you believe you can start Mr. Vale's Camaro, step onto the platform. Nobody moved. The same spectators who had spent the last hour shouting advice suddenly became very interested in their phones or cups of coffee. Declan looked at the stage, then turned away. "Let's go," he said quietly. Mason blinked. "Seriously? We came to enjoy the show." "I think we already did." They walked back across the crowded fairgrounds, passing rows of polished Chevelles, Mustangs, and Corvettes that gleamed beneath the late afternoon sun. Kids posed for photos beside vintage pickups while food vendors shouted daily specials over. The music drifting through loudspeakers. It looked like every other American car show. Only Declan wasn't really seeing any of it. His mind kept replaying tiny details from the Camaro. A hose clamp positioned half an inch differently than he expected. Fresh fingerprints on one polished valve cover. The expression on the last mechanic's face after the engine refused to cooperate. Something didn't fit. But experience had taught him something else. Seeing a problem didn't automatically mean he should solve it. They climbed into Declan's 15-year-old pickup truck. The driver's seat had a tear patched with gray duct tape. The dashboard carried over 300,000 miles. It started every morning anyway. Mason buckled his seatbelt. You wanted to say something back there. Declan pulled onto the highway. I usually do. So why didn't you? Declan watched the traffic before answering. Confidence can become expensive. Mason frowned. I don't get it. You will. The conversation faded into the steady hum of tires on asphalt. An hour later, they pulled into Shaw Automotive, a small two-bay garage on the edge of a quiet Texas town. The paint on the sign had faded years ago, and only one service bay was open. Inside sat an aging family SUV waiting for a transmission repair that had already taken longer than Declan promised. His phone vibrated before he reached the office door. The landlord. Again. Declan let it ring. Inside the office, unpaid invoices were stacked neatly beside a calendar with 3 overdue utility notices clipped to it. Mason noticed the papers. We're okay, right? Declan forced a smile. We're still open. It wasn't really an answer. Mason knew it. So did Declan. While his son finished homework at the small desk in the corner, Declan rolled beneath the SUV with a work light. The familiar rhythm of turning wrenches usually quieted his thoughts. Not today. Every few minutes, the image of the Camaro returned. Not because of the prize money, because something about it challenged everything he believed he knew. Just before closing time, an older customer arrived to pick up his pickup truck. Mr. Alvarez had been bringing vehicles to Declan for almost 8 years. You look distracted, the older man said while signing the invoice. Long day. I heard about that Billionaire's challenge on the radio. Declan kept wiping grease from his hands. So did everyone else. Mr. Alvarez smiled. They said nobody could start the car. Declan nodded. That's what they said. You thinking about giving it a shot? For several seconds, Declan didn't answer. Finally, he shook his head. I've spent too much of my life believing I could fix every problem. Mr. Alvarez studied him carefully. You know, that's not why people trust you. Declan looked up. They trust you because when you don't know something. The older man handed him the payment envelope. You usually admit it. Those words stayed with Declan long after the garage lights were turned off. Later that evening, after Mason had fallen asleep on the couch with a history book across his chest, Declan sat alone at the kitchen table. The rent notice lay beside a notebook filled with repair estimates. $500,000 would erase every debt he had. But every time he imagined walking onto that stage, another memory appeared first. A crowded workshop. A younger version of himself. Absolute certainty. Then one terrible mistake that had cost someone else far more than money. He closed the notebook. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. For the first time in years, Declan wondered if avoiding another mistake had quietly become an excuse for never taking another meaningful risk. Declan barely slept. By sunrise, he was already standing outside the garage with a mug of black coffee, watching rainwater drip from the edge of the roof. Mason came out a few minutes later carrying 2 breakfast burritos wrapped in foil. I figured you'd forget to eat, he said. Declan accepted one with a grateful smile. You're getting smarter every year. I have to. Somebody around here has to remind you. For the first time in days, Declan laughed. The moment didn't last. His eyes drifted toward the folded flyer lying on the passenger seat of the pickup. One final day. $500,000 Camaro challenge. Mason followed his father's gaze. So, we're going. Declan took another sip of coffee before answering. I didn't say that. You've been thinking about that car since we left. I've been thinking about a mistake. They're not the same thing. Declan looked at his son. No, but one reminds me of the other. An hour later, they were back at the Lone Star Classic Auto Expo. The crowd had grown even larger than the day before. News stations had arrived from neighboring cities, hoping someone would finally solve the mystery that had become the talk of every automotive forum in Texas. The giant countdown clock above the stage showed just under 5 hours remaining before the challenge officially ended. Harrison Vale stood beside the Camaro, greeting reporters with practiced confidence. Not far away, Audrey Sinclair reviewed another stack of diagnostic printouts. She had spent most of the previous night comparing every measurement collected during yesterday's failed attempts. None of the numbers agreed with the conclusions. That bothered her. Engine data didn't lie. People did. She looked up just as Declan entered the exhibition hall. Their eyes met for only a second before she walked toward him. You came back. I guess I did. I was hoping you would. Declan looked surprised. You don't even know me. I know enough. She extended her hand. Audrey Sinclair. He shook it. Declan Shaw. I watched every expert yesterday. So did I. They all reached for tools within 2 minutes. Declan nodded. I noticed. You didn't. No. Why? He glanced toward the Camaro. Because I wasn't trying to fix it. Audrey folded her arms. What were you trying to do? Figure out what everyone else believed without questioning. She smiled. That's either very smart or completely wrong. Declan smiled back. Usually it's both. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Audrey lowered her voice. I reviewed the diagnostic logs. And they don't support the explanations people gave on stage. What do they support? I honestly don't know. Declan respected that answer more than any confident theory. Neither of them noticed Mason listening from a few feet away. His father had spent years avoiding conversations like this. Years pretending ordinary repair jobs were enough. Now there was curiosity in his voice again. That worried Mason almost as much as it encouraged him. Across the exhibition floor, the announcer called for new participants. Several mechanics stepped forward. Another failure followed. The Camaro refused to cooperate. The crowd groaned. A television producer hurried toward Harrison. We need someone new. We're running out of stories. Declan watched another specialist climb down from the platform, shaking his head. Audrey looked at him carefully. I have a question. Shoot. If you stepped up there. She paused. What would you check first? Declan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched two assistants close the hood after the latest attempt. They're all trying to answer the same question, which is, why won't the engine start? Audrey nodded. Isn't that the question? Declan slowly shook his head. No. He took one step toward the stage. The better question is, why is everyone so certain they're looking in the right place? For the first time since arriving, he reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out a pair of well-worn work gloves. Mason saw them. His heartbeat quickened. He knew those gloves. The last time his father had worn them to prove something, their lives had changed forever. This time, Declan slipped them on without another word and started walking toward the registration table. The registration volunteer looked up from the clipboard. Name, Declan Shaw. She searched the list, wrote down his number, and handed him a participant badge. You'll have 30 minutes with the vehicle. No replacement parts. No outside assistance. Safety rules apply at all times. Declan nodded. I understand. As he walked toward the stage, hundreds of conversations blended into a low roar. Some people glanced at his worn work jacket and quietly returned to their phones. Others assumed he was simply another mechanic about to fail. Mason stopped near the front barrier. You don't have to prove anything, he called. Declan looked back. I'm not trying to prove anything. It was true. At least, that was what he wanted to believe. Audrey met him beside the Camaro. I'll be monitoring the inspection process, she said. If you need any readings, I'll provide them. I won't offer opinions unless you ask. Fair enough. For the first few minutes, Declan never touched a wrench. He slowly circled the car, crouching beside each wheel, studying the engine bay, checking the firewall, the wiring harness, even the wear marks around old fasteners. He opened the driver's door, closed it again, then stood perfectly still as if listening to something no one else could hear. The crowd grew restless. One commentator whispered into a television microphone. Either this guy is a genius, or he's buying time. Declan finally leaned over the engine compartment. He checked several connections, then asked Audrey for the latest diagnostic readings. She handed him the tablet. He studied the numbers for less than a minute. A familiar feeling settled into his chest. The pieces seemed to fit too easily. He remembered the confidence he used to have years ago, that dangerous certainty that once convinced him every answer could be found before every question had been asked. Instead of challenging that instinct, he accepted it. I think I know what's happening, he said quietly. Audrey looked at him. You sound confident. I am. She hesitated. There are still a few readings that don't completely line up. Declan glanced at the screen again. They're probably side effects. Probably. It was a small word. Small enough to ignore. Large enough to matter. Harrison Vale stepped closer. So, Mr. Shaw, are you ready? Declan closed the hood. I'd like permission to start the engine. The crowd immediately fell silent. Television cameras tightened their focus. Mason gripped the metal barrier so tightly his knuckles turned white. Audrey watched Declan carefully. Something about the expression on his face troubled her. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had already solved the puzzle. She had seen that look before. Not on him. On every expert who had failed yesterday, Declan settled into the driver's seat. He adjusted the mirror out of habit, rested one hand on the steering wheel, and took a slow breath. Outside, thousands of people waited for a miracle. Inside, he trusted the conclusion he had reached far sooner than he should have. His hand moved toward the ignition key. For a brief moment, every sound across the fairgrounds disappeared. Then he turned it. The starter spun. The engine caught. A ripple of excitement swept through the crowd. For one breathtaking second, it sounded as if the impossible had finally happened. Then the Camaro stumbled. A sharp pop echoed beneath the hood. The idol collapsed. Silence. Thousands of people stood frozen. Declan kept both hands on the steering wheel. He didn't try the key again. Outside, the announcer struggled to fill the silence. It looked promising. The sentence faded away. It hadn't been promising. It had been wrong. Declan slowly stepped out of the driver's seat. Nobody laughed at first. They were waiting for him to explain why the engine had died. He looked toward Audrey. "Can I see the live data again?" She handed him the tablet without saying a word. Declan studied every number. The evidence was staring back at him. One pressure reading disagreed with his conclusion. Another sensor value had been slightly outside the pattern. He had noticed both. He had dismissed both, because they didn't fit the answer he wanted. Harrison Vale approached carefully. "Do you know what happened?" Declan looked directly at him. "Yes." "You found another problem?" Declan shook his head. "I found mine." Several reporters leaned closer. One shouted, "So your diagnosis was wrong?" Declan didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word surprised everyone. In an industry where reputations were protected at almost any cost, admitting a mistake in front of cameras was almost unheard of. The crowd began whispering. Some people respected the honesty. Others assumed the challenge was over. Mason stood behind the barrier, watching his father with anxious eyes. He had never seen him answer a question like that. Years ago, Declan would have argued. He would have defended every decision. Today, he simply accepted the truth. Audrey glanced back at the diagnostic screen. "I warned you there were readings that didn't fit." "You did. And you ignored them." "I did." Neither accusation nor excuse filled the space between them. Only facts. Declan looked back at the Camaro. "I wanted the first answer to be the right one." Audrey folded her arms. "Why?" He gave a tired smile. "Because I remembered the mechanic I used to be. And I forgot the mechanic I need to become." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Declan turned toward Harrison. "I have a request." "I'm listening." "Don't give me another attempt." That answer surprised everyone even more. "I'd like permission to start over." Harrison frowned. "You mean another try?" "No." Declan looked at the engine bay. "I mean, I want to throw away every conclusion I reached today." He pointed toward the open hood. "I don't want to prove I was almost right. I want to find out what's actually true." The billionaire studied him quietly. "And how would you do that?" Declan looked toward Audrey. "I'd like her to challenge every assumption I make." Audrey blinked. "You want someone checking your work?" "I need someone checking my thinking." She had spent years watching experienced technicians treat questions as personal attacks. This was different. Declan wasn't protecting his pride anymore. He was protecting the process. Harrison looked toward the television crew. The producer was already signaling that the broadcast schedule was slipping. Another delay would cost money. Another delay might cost viewers. Finally, Harrison turned back. "You'll have one condition." Declan waited. "No shortcuts." A faint smile crossed Declan's face. "I wasn't planning on taking any." For the first time since walking onto the stage, he no longer felt like a man trying to win $500,000. He felt like a mechanic trying to earn back the right to trust his own hands, one honest step at a time. The television cameras stopped following Declan. That was exactly what he wanted. The public demonstration had become a private investigation. Inside a temporary inspection tent behind the main stage, the noise of the auto show faded into a distant murmur. The black Camaro sat with its hood open under bright work lights. For the first time all weekend, nobody was trying to impress an audience. Declan laid his notebook on a rolling tool cart. "We start from zero." Audrey nodded. "No assumptions. No favorites. No shortcuts." She closed the previous diagnostic report and set it aside. "Agreed." Mason watched quietly from a designated viewing area outside the safety line. He had never seen his father willingly erase his own work before. Declan removed a clean sheet of paper and wrote one sentence across the top. "What do we actually know? Not what they believed. Not what yesterday's experts claimed, only what they could prove. They began with the basics: compression, fuel delivery, spark, timing. Each system was tested independently, every measurement recorded before anyone offered an opinion. Hours earlier, Declan would have jumped ahead after spotting a familiar pattern. Now he forced himself to slow down. Audrey noticed. "You're checking things you already inspected." "I know. You think you missed something?" "I think I stopped looking the moment I found an answer I liked." She smiled slightly. "That's harder to admit than being wrong." "It should be." One by one, assumptions disappeared. The ignition components matched factory specifications. Fuel pressure stayed within range. Compression remained consistent across every cylinder. Nothing pointed toward a catastrophic failure. Yet something still wasn't right. Audrey leaned over the engine bay. "Look at this." She pointed toward a small section near the distributor. At first glance it appeared perfectly normal. Then Declan crouched lower. A tiny witness mark on a fastener didn't line up with the surrounding hardware. Someone had adjusted it before. Not recently. Long ago. He didn't celebrate the discovery. Instead, he asked another question. "What evidence says this matters?" Audrey reviewed maintenance photos provided by Harrison's collection manager. Most were taken during cosmetic restorations. Very few documented mechanical work. Still, one older photograph caught her attention. "The mark is different here." Declan compared the image to the engine in front of them. So something changed, but not enough to explain everything. Not by itself. He smiled. "Good." Audrey looked puzzled. "Good. If one clue explains the whole problem, we're probably rushing again." She laughed softly. "I've never heard anyone complain that a diagnosis was too easy." "I have. I was usually talking to myself." They continued working through the afternoon, building a picture piece by piece instead of chasing a single dramatic answer. No hidden sabotage. No mysterious electronic device. No impossible mechanical curse. Just several small inconsistencies that had quietly accumulated through years of well-intentioned repairs. Individually, none of them could keep the Camaro from running. Together, they created a failure that looked like something entirely different. Outside the tent, reporters continued speculating about secret modifications and elaborate tricks. Inside, Declan barely noticed. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to be the smartest mechanic in the room. He was trying to be the most careful one. As the final inspection sheet filled with notes, Audrey looked over at him. "I think we're finally asking the right questions." Declan closed the notebook. "And that's the first honest progress we've made all day." Neither of them reached for the ignition key. Not yet. This time, they were determined that certainty would come after the evidence, not before it. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the exhibition grounds as word quietly spread that the challenge had not ended after all. Most spectators assumed another dramatic attempt was coming. Instead, they found Declan and Audrey still standing over pages of notes. No speeches, no celebration, just two people refusing to guess. A production assistant hurried into the inspection tent, looking frustrated. "Mr. Vale needs an answer. The live broadcast has already gone long." Declan looked up from the engine. "I don't have an answer yet. You have thousands of people waiting." "I know. They're expecting another attempt." Declan wiped his hands with a clean shop towel. "They're going to have to wait." The assistant left, shaking his head. A few minutes later, Harrison Vale walked in himself. He studied the open hood before speaking. "How close are you?" Declan answered honestly. "Closer than before." "Can you make it start?" There was a long pause. "Probably." The billionaire raised an eyebrow. "Probably. I can make it fire." "But..." Declan looked directly at him. "I don't know if it will stay healthy." Audrey understood exactly what he meant. Several temporary adjustments could force the Camaro to run long enough to satisfy the rules of the challenge. The crowd would cheer. The cameras would capture the moment. The prize could be awarded. But the underlying mechanical issue would still exist. It would simply be hidden. Harrison folded his arms. "So what's stopping you?" Declan rested one hand on the fender. "My own conscience." Silence settled over the tent. Finally, Harrison asked, "If the engine starts, isn't that what the challenge requires?" "Technically." And Declan took a slow breath. "If someone buys this car tomorrow believing it's truly fixed, then I've only moved the problem into someone else's future." Audrey looked at him with quiet respect. Yesterday, this was the same man who had rushed toward the first explanation that made sense. Now he was willing to lose everything rather than claim a victory he hadn't earned. Outside the tent, Mason watched through the clear safety panels. He couldn't hear every word, but he recognized something in his father's posture. The tension was gone, not because the problem had been solved, because the fear of admitting uncertainty had disappeared. Harrison glanced toward the television crew waiting outside. They're asking whether we're ready. Declan shook his head. No. If I tell them we're delaying again, people won't be happy. I understand. And if I end the challenge now? Declan gave a small nod. That's your decision. You'd walk away from $500,000? Declan smiled faintly. I've already walked away from something much more valuable once. Harrison didn't ask what he meant. He could see it in Declan's eyes. This wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't even about the money. It was about finishing a job honestly. Audrey stepped beside the engine and pointed to several notes they had written throughout the afternoon. I think we're down to one final inconsistency. Declan leaned closer. The measurements finally formed a pattern that none of them had recognized before because each individual reading had seemed too small to matter. Not one major defect. Several tiny errors quietly reinforcing one another. He looked at Audrey. If this pattern is right, then we don't need a shortcut. She nodded. We need one more hour. Harrison checked his watch. The event schedule was already in chaos. Reporters were growing impatient. Sponsors were waiting. Yet for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he trusted the man standing in front of him. 1 hour, Harrison said. No more. Declan extended his hand. That's all we're asking. As Harrison walked out to address the restless crowd, Declan turned back toward the Camaro. He no longer felt the pressure to win. He felt something better. The responsibility to deserve the result, whatever that result might be. Exactly 58 minutes later, Harrison Vale stepped back onto the stage. The conversations across the exhibition grounds slowly faded. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, we have one final attempt. This time, there was no dramatic music, no countdown clock, no promises that history was about to be made. Only quiet anticipation. Declan walked toward the Camaro carrying nothing except a small notebook and a clean shop rag. Audrey followed a few steps behind with a diagnostic tablet tucked under her arm. Before touching the car, Declan turned to her. I want you to check every step. I will. If you think I'm wrong, I'll stop you. He smiled. Good. For the first time all weekend, he wasn't asking people to trust him. He was asking them to verify him. The hood was already open. Declan carefully completed the final adjustments they had agreed upon during the last hour. Every connection was inspected twice. Every measurement was compared against the notes they had made together. Nothing was rushed. The television commentator whispered into his microphone. This is very different from earlier. His partner nodded. Earlier he was trying to prove he was right. Now he's trying to make sure he isn't wrong. Several experienced mechanics standing near the front exchanged quiet looks. One of them said softly, "That's the mark of someone who's learned something." When the last inspection was complete, Declan stepped away from the engine. I'm finished. Audrey didn't answer immediately. Instead, she began her own independent review. She checked every fastener they had touched. She compared live sensor readings with the baseline measurements. She reviewed fuel pressure one final time, then ignition timing, then electrical continuity. Nearly 5 minutes passed. The silence felt longer than the previous 2 days combined. Finally, Audrey closed the tablet. I can't find a reason not to proceed. Declan didn't move. You sure? She looked back at the engine once more. I'm sure. Instead of climbing into the driver's seat immediately, Declan looked toward Mason. His son stood behind the safety barrier exactly where he had been all afternoon. Their eyes met. Mason smiled. Not because he expected his father to win. Because for the first time in years, he had watched his father stop measuring himself by whether he looked perfect. That was already a victory. Declan opened the driver's door and settled behind the wheel. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel. No shaking. No hurry. Outside the windshield, he saw Harrison, Audrey, Mason, dozens of mechanics, television cameras, and hundreds of strangers waiting for a single sound. He turned the key. The starter engaged. The engine rotated once, twice, then came alive with a deep, unmistakable V8 rumble. Nobody cheered. Not yet. Declan didn't touch the throttle. He simply listened. The idle remained smooth. Oil pressure stabilized. Temperature readings climbed exactly as expected. Audrey watched every live data stream. 30 seconds. 1 minute. Still steady. She slowly looked up from the tablet. It's healthy. Only then did the crowd erupt. Applause rolled through the exhibition grounds. People who had spent 2 days debating impossible theories now stood shoulder to shoulder applauding a result that had come from patience instead of spectacle. Television reporters rushed forward. What was the secret? Declan stepped out of the car and gently closed the driver's door. There wasn't one. The reporter looked confused. Then why couldn't anyone else start it? Declan glanced toward Audrey before answering. Because all of us, including me at first, were looking for one big answer. He rested his hand lightly on the Camaro's roof. The truth was smaller than that. He smiled. Several little problems were working together. Another reporter asked, "So what changed?" Declan looked around at the people gathered near the stage. I did. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The running engine behind him said everything that still needed to be heard. The applause continued long after the reporters stopped asking questions. Harrison Vale waited until the crowd settled before walking toward Declan with a microphone in one hand and a certified cashier's check in the other. You completed the challenge exactly as promised, Harrison said. The prize is yours. Declan looked at the check for a long moment before accepting it. Not with excitement. With gratitude. The money would pay the overdue rent on his garage. It would erase the stack of bills waiting on his kitchen table. It would give Mason a little more security than he had known in years. But something far more valuable had already happened before the check ever changed hands. Declan had recovered the confidence to say, "I don't know," without feeling like a failure. He turned toward Audrey. "I couldn't have finished this alone." She smiled. "You finished it because you finally stopped trying to." The crowd laughed softly. Harrison extended his hand to Audrey as well. "Thank you for protecting the process instead of the spotlight." She nodded. Good engineering isn't about proving we're right. It's about discovering the truth. Several veteran mechanics approached Declan after the ceremony. One admitted he would have forced the engine to run just long enough to win the challenge. Another confessed he had ignored the same conflicting readings that Declan eventually returned to. No one seemed embarrassed anymore. Instead, they talked openly about mistakes, learning, and the responsibility that came with working on machines people trusted with their lives. A week later, Shaw Automotive looked exactly the way it always had. The same faded sign. The same old pickup parked outside. The same pair of service bays. The only noticeable difference was a handwritten note framed near the front counter. It read, "Never let confidence arrive before the evidence." Customers often asked about it. Declan simply smiled and returned to work. Nothing about his attitude suggested he had become a celebrity. Nothing suggested he believed success had made him more important than anyone else. One afternoon, Mason looked around the busy garage. "You know," he said, "people recognize you now." Declan tightened the last bolt on a family sedan before answering. "I hope they remember the lesson more than they remember me." "What lesson?" Declan set the wrench down. "That being wrong isn't what hurts us. Pretending we're never wrong does." Mason nodded thoughtfully. As the narrator looking at this story from the outside, one truth stands above everything else. The headlines focused on a billionaire, a classic Camaro, and a $500,000 prize. Those things made people curious enough to watch. But they were never the heart of the story. The heart of the story was a father who chose honesty over pride, patience over shortcuts, and character over applause. Money can solve financial problems, but it cannot replace integrity. Fame can attract attention, but it cannot earn genuine respect. Real respect comes from the way we treat people, especially when no reward is guaranteed. Whether someone is wealthy or struggling to pay next month's rent, every person deserves dignity, kindness, and the chance to be heard. A person's bank account does not measure their worth, their intelligence, or their character. Judging someone as less valuable simply because they are poor says far more about the person doing the judging than the one being judged. On that stage, a billionaire, an engineer, a small-town mechanic, and a 12-year-old boy all learned the same lesson from different perspectives. The greatest victories are not always measured by the money we receive. Sometimes they are measured by the person we become while earning the right to receive it.